The belief was absolute. Their tanks were invincible. This conviction was not born of propaganda, but forged in the crucible of continental warfare. The Type 95 Hago, a lightweight and agile machine, had comprehensively proven its supposed superiority against the outmatched and poorly equipped forces of China. It had held its own, at least in the eyes of its commanders, during the fierce and bloody border clashes against Soviet armor at Halkin Bal, and it had been the steel spearhead for the stunning, lightning-fast victories that swept through Malaya and the Philippines. The tank crews of the Imperial Japanese Army, brimming with a hard-won confidence, genuinely believed their light tanks represented the absolute pinnacle of armored warfare design. They saw them as machines perfectly optimized for the unique challenges of the dense jungles and scattered islands of the vast Pacific theater. After all, they had systematically crushed every single opponent they had yet encountered. This belief, however, was profoundly and fatally wrong. The story of how they came to this shattering, battlefield realization does not begin with defeat, but with a deep-seated and dangerous institutional confidence that had been built over years of misleading battlefield successes. The Hago itself was no mere accident of design. It was the deliberate, calculated product of meticulous military planning that commenced back in 1933. It was then that the Japanese Imperial Army's High Command identified a critical and glaring deficiency in its armored doctrine. Their primary workhorse, the Type 89 medium tank, was a plodding infantry support beast capable of a mere 15 miles per hour. While this was technically sufficient for its intended role of supporting infantry advancing at a walking pace, it was utterly inadequate for the new, fast-paced, mechanized warfare that the Army's more forward-thinking strategists envisioned for the future. These Japanese military planners had observed with keen interest as other global powers, particularly in Europe, began developing faster, more mobile, and more independent armored forces. They craved a new kind of tank, one that could finally keep pace with their motorized infantry, which was moving at 40 miles per hour in trucks. They desperately needed a vehicle that could expertly navigate the varied and difficult terrain of Manchuria and China, and, most crucially, one that could be mass-produced in significant quantities that their burgeoning but still limited industrial base could realistically sustain. The Army Technical Bureau issued its formal specifications for this new vehicle in July 1933. The tank would weigh approximately 7 tons, be armed with a 37mm gun, achieve a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour, and possess armor plating just sufficient to repel standard rifle and machine gun fire. Above all else, it was mandated to be mechanically simple to manufacture and easy to maintain in the field by crews with limited technical support. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries secured the prestigious contract, and the immense challenge was taken up by the brilliant engineer Tomi Ohata, who had already distinguished himself by designing the Type 89. His most significant and lasting innovation for this new light tank was the bell crank suspension system, a simple yet remarkably effective and rugged design that would become a standard feature on nearly all Japanese tanks for the next decade. By June of 1934, Mitsubishi had successfully completed the first prototype. This initial model, put through a grueling series of tests, deeply impressed the military observers during extensive field trials conducted both in the harsh environment of Manchuria and at heavily monitored proving grounds within Japan. It was undeniably fast, easily reaching 45 kilometers per hour on paved roads and maintaining a respectable 25 to 30 kilometers per hour across open, uneven country. It was also incredibly maneuverable, boasting a tight turning radius that seemed almost impossible for a tracked vehicle of its size. The Hago's unique bell crank suspension absorbed shocks reasonably well and permitted the tank to traverse rough, broken terrain that would have definitively immobilized other less capable vehicles. Furthermore, it proved mechanically reliable, powered by a robust Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine that generated 120 horsepower at 1800 RPM.
This diesel engine was a particular point of pride for Japanese engineers. Beyond its reliability, it made the tank far less vulnerable to catching fire when hit compared to the gasoline-powered vehicles common in other armies. Logistically, diesel fuel was also more readily available within Japan's expanding empire, especially in resource-poor regions like Manchuria and Southeast Asia, where gasoline supplies were scarce. The engine could operate for 8 to 10 hours on its internal 34-gallon fuel capacity, giving the tank a practical operational range of approximately 130 miles on roads. Naturally, the trials did reveal some notable flaws. The suspension, while rugged, had a pronounced tendency to pitch violently and erratically on uneven ground, making it nearly impossible for the gunner to aim the gun while moving, and causing significant bone-jarring fatigue for the crew. Engineers quickly addressed this by adding braces to connect the bogey pairs, creating a modified system that became colloquially known as the Manchurian suspension. This modification helped stabilize the ride, but it never completely cured the jarring, rough-and-tumble experience that would characterize the Hago for its entire service life. In 1935, at a decisive meeting within the Army Technical Bureau, the Type 95 was presented as the potential main tank for Japan's new mechanized infantry units. This proposal was met with resistance. Representatives from the infantry, in particular, voiced serious, well-founded concerns. They argued forcefully that a mere 12 millimeters of armor was dangerously, almost suicidally insufficient for a tank that would be expected to support frontal assaults against fortified enemy positions armed with anti-tank rifles and cannons. The cavalry representatives, in turn, countered these arguments, insisting that the tank's vastly improved speed and tactical mobility more than compensated for its thin armor, and that its 37mm gun's firepower was perfectly adequate for its intended cavalry and reconnaissance role of fighting other light vehicles and infantry. After considerable and heated debate, a compromise was reached. The infantry reluctantly agreed to accept the design as is, and the Type 95 Hago was thus officially adopted into service. Its numerical designation was derived from the Japanese imperial calendar, marking the 2595th year since the legendary founding of Japan. As was tradition, only the last two digits, 95, were used for the type number. Full-scale production commenced at Mitsubishi's facilities in 1936. The Hago was by any measure a diminutive tank. It measured just 4.38 meters long, 2.06 meters wide, and 2.13 meters tall. To put that in perspective for an American audience, that's only 14 feet 4 inches long, 6 feet 9 inches wide, and just under 7 feet tall. An average height man could easily look clean over the top of its turret. Its combat weight was 7.4 tons for the basic tank, rising to 8.1 tons when fully loaded with its crew, fuel, and all its ammunition. The armor was, as the infantry had feared, paper-thin by any global standard. 12 millimeters, less than half an inch at its absolute thickest points on the turret face and upper hull, 9 millimeters on the roof and floor, and as little as 6 millimeters in less critical areas.
Japanese designers had calculated this was just enough to stop standard rifle and machine gun bullets at typical combat ranges. They were, in essence, designing a tank to fight the enemies they had already encountered and fully anticipated. Poorly armed Chinese forces with virtually no anti-tank capability and the light Soviet tanks of the era. Inside, the tank was incredibly, almost inhumanely cramped, housing a crew of 3 men. The driver sat in the front left of the hull, peering out at the world through a tiny slit-like viewport and a rudimentary periscope. To his right sat a whole machine gunner, tasked with operating a Type 97 7.7mm machine gun mounted in a simple ball mount. The commander, however, was relegated to the small one-man turret, which he occupied entirely alone, standing on the whole floor with no turret basket to steady him as the tank pitched and lurched. This commander arguably had one of the most physically demanding and mentally overwhelming jobs in the entire Imperial Japanese Army. He had to simultaneously perform the duties of at least 3 men,
He had to command the tank, directing the driver over the engine's roar and communicating with other tanks, when a radio was even available, which was a luxury, as only one tank in 4 was equipped with a set, forcing the others to rely on easily obscured visual flag signals. He also had to aim and fire the main gun, a Type 94 37mm cannon, and then, after firing, he had to physically load the next round himself, a difficult, jarring task in the cramped, standing room-only space. As if that all weren't enough, he was also responsible for operating a second machine gun mounted in the rear of the turret, facing backward at roughly the 5 o'clock position to protect the tank's vulnerable rear. American tankers who later examined captured Hagos were completely baffled, marveling that any single person could function effectively, let alone fight, under such an immense and impossible workload. The Japanese commander had no seat, forcing him to stand for the entire duration of combat, either dangerously exposed by opening the hatch for better vision, or confined and half-blind with it closed. The turret itself was rotated not by an electric motor, but by a primitive physical hand crank, requiring significant muscular effort to traverse against the tank's motion. Yet it must be said, in its intended role and against the specific opponents it was designed to face, the Hago performed exceptionally well. The tank first saw major combat in China beginning in 1937, where it proved utterly devastating against Chinese forces who possessed almost no armor and a very limited number of effective anti-tank weapons. Its 37mm gun obliterated traditional fortifications, its machine guns suppressed and cut down infantry in the open, and its superior mobility allowed Japanese columns to exploit breakthroughs and relentlessly pursue enemy forces. This lopsided combat environment allowed Japanese tank crews to gain valuable battlefield experience and build an immense, almost arrogant confidence. The critical flaw was that this confidence was built on a dangerous assumption that the Hago was a genuinely capable world-class tank, rather than what it truly was, a specialized, lightweight vehicle optimized for a very specific low-threat scenario. This assumption was first truly tested and arguably should have been shattered at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, when Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Union along the Mongolian border. Here, for the first time, the Hago faced real modern opposition. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks armed with high-velocity 45mm guns had vastly superior armor penetration, and their own armor was thick enough to make frontal engagements with the Hago's 37mm gun extremely difficult and often futile. The battles were brutal and costly. Though an initial aggressive surprise assault by the Japanese 3rd Tank Regiment achieved some tactical success, the subsequent Soviet counterattacks, often en masse, quickly and bloodily exposed the Hago's critical vulnerabilities. Soviet guns could easily penetrate the Hago's thin armor at ranges where the Japanese guns were ineffective, bouncing harmlessly off the BT tanks. The lessons were stark and should have been unambiguous. The Hago was dangerously outmatched by modern tank design. Its thin protection and weak gun were woefully inadequate for tank-versus-tank combat against a peer adversary. However, these critical lessons were not fully absorbed by the high command in Tokyo. Instead of acknowledging a fundamental design flaw and ordering a crash program for a replacement, they focused on minor tactical improvements and blamed crew training, dangerously ignoring the technological warning sign. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese tank units, spearheaded by the Hago, once again achieved spectacular successes. In Malaya, they navigated dense jungle terrain that British commanders had confidently deemed impassable for any armored vehicle, relentlessly supporting the rapid Japanese advance down the peninsula towards the fortress of Singapore. In the Philippines, Hagos supported the invasion, and on December 22, 1941, they engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks in what would be recorded as the first tank-versus-tank battle for U.S. forces in the Pacific theater. Although the American M3 Stuart actually had better armor, the highly experienced Japanese crews, veterans of China and Khalkhin Gol, achieved tactical success in the confused, close-range jungle fighting. These early, easy victories only served to reinforce the Japanese military's misplaced confidence. From their perspective, the Hago was performing flawlessly, exactly as designed. So when the orders came down to defend the vital island of Saipan in 1944, the Japanese High Command shipped their tanks, including the 9th Tank Regiment, without a second thought as to their adequacy against their new industrial giant opponent. But Saipan would be different. This island in the Mariana Chain was strategically critical, a dagger pointed at the heart of the empire. At just 1,250 miles from Tokyo, its capture would place the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers within easy striking range of the Japanese home islands. The empire's leaders knew this and fortified Saipan with over 30,000 troops, including the 9th Tank Regiment under Colonel Takashi Goto, equipped with 44 tanks, a mix of the Type 95 Hagos and the slightly larger 57mm gun-armed Type 97 Chihas. This was, by a large margin, the most significant armored force the Americans had yet faced in the Pacific. The American assault began on June 15, 1944. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions stormed the western beaches under a heavy, unrelenting hail of Japanese artillery and mortar fire. By nightfall, 20,000 combat troops were ashore, and with them, landing from LSTs, came their own M4 Sherman medium tanks. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, the Japanese commander on Saipan, understood his desperate situation. He had to strike immediately to drive the Americans back into the sea before they could consolidate their beachhead and bring their full, overwhelming combat power to bear. He ordered a massive, all-or-nothing counterattack for the pre-dawn hours of June 17th to be spearheaded by the 9th Tank Regiment. Colonel Goto gathered his crews. They were confident, veterans of past victories, and they trusted their machines. In the pre-dawn darkness, the Japanese tank column moved out, 44 strong, diesel engines clanking toward the unsuspecting American lines.
The Marines heard them coming. Sentry reports of engine sounds sent men scrambling to their defensive positions. Anti-tank gun crews aimed their 37mm guns into the darkness, and Sherman tank crews, who had been resting near their vehicles, climbed aboard and started their engines. At 0330 hours, the attack began. 44 Japanese tanks, the largest armored assault of the Pacific War, charged toward the lines of the 2nd Marine Division. Marine riflemen saw them first as hulking dark shapes emerging from the gloom, and then the air was filled with the sound of roaring diesel engines and clanking steel tracks. And then something entirely unexpected happened. Marine machine gunners dug into foxholes and positioned behind cover, opened fire with their Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These were not the standard 30-caliber infantry weapons. These were the heavy 50-caliber Ma-Deuce machine guns, weapons designed primarily to engage aircraft and destroy light vehicles, not tanks. The 50-caliber M2 was and is a formidable weapon. Its armor-piercing round could penetrate 23 millimeters of hardened steel at 200 meters. The Type 95 Hago's thickest armor was only 12 millimeters. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and unforgiving. As the Marines opened fire, their tracer rounds streaking across the dark battlefield like red lasers, the 50-caliber bullets didn't just dent the tanks. They didn't ricochet off. They punched straight through. At close range, some rounds were reported to have gone in one side of the tank and clean out the other. Inside the cramped, thin-skinned Japanese tanks, the crews experienced a terrifying, apocalyptic revelation. The machine gun fire wasn't just deafening noise on the outside of the hull. It was lethal, armor-shredding penetration.
Rounds tore through the thin steel, shredding engine components, detonating ammunition, and eviscerating the crew members inside. One Marine gunner later reported watching his tracers hit a Ha-Go charging his position, seeing sparks inside the tank through its vision ports, and then watching it grind to a halt, black smoke pouring from its engine. Another gunner, firing from a half-track, stitched a long burst into a tank's side armor. He saw the commander in the turret slump forward, killed instantly by a round that had passed straight through the 12mm turret wall as if it were cardboard. The Japanese crews who survived these initial volleys were in a state of profound shock. Their armor, the very thing that was supposed to protect them, was being defeated by simple, ubiquitous infantry machine guns. The realization was devastating. If infantry machine guns could kill them, what chance did they possibly have? A captured Japanese officer, his face a mask of disbelief, later confessed to interrogators that he thought the Americans must be using some new secret weapon, some exotic ammunition, as he simply could not accept that a standard heavy machine gun could defeat a tank. As the Japanese attack faltered and dissolved into chaos under this unexpected and overwhelming fire, the American M4 Sherman tanks moved forward to engage. The contrast that followed was not a battle, it was an execution. The 7.4-ton Ha-Go faced the 31.8-ton Sherman. The Ha-Go's 12mm of armor faced the Sherman's 51mm of angled frontal armor, which was effectively much thicker. And the Ha-Go's small 37mm gun faced the Sherman's massive 75mm main gun, a weapon that could destroy the Japanese tank from over a mile away. When the Shermans opened fire, the results were conclusive. Japanese tanks were blown apart, their turrets ripped clean from their hulls. The Japanese 37mm and 57mm rounds, in the rare instances they could get a shot off, bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's thick, sloped armor. The battle descended into what one Marine officer later described as a madhouse. By mid-morning on June 17th, the counterattack was over. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks, burning and silent, littered the battlefield. For the Marines who walked among the wrecks, a new grim truth emerged. These tanks weren't formidable at all. They pointed to the clean, round 50-caliber entry holes and the larger, torn exit holes on the other side. The interiors were cramped, crude, and offered no real protection. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese tankers was profound and permanent. Their equipment was not just outmatched, it was hopelessly obsolete, a rolling death trap. Interrogated prisoners expressed a universal sense of shock at the sheer volume and quality of American firepower, with many voicing a deep feeling of betrayal by their own leaders for being sent into a modern industrial war with 1930s-era equipment. This brutal lesson from Saipan informed Marine tactics for the rest of the war. Japanese tanks were not a serious threat. The innate fear of armor evaporated. The battle for Saipan itself would rage on for weeks, but this single armored clash had immediate strategic consequences. The island's eventual fall and the threat it posed to the homeland directly led to the resignation of Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Toyo and, for the first time, a reluctant admission in the Japanese media that the war was going poorly. For Japanese tankers on other islands, the pattern of Saipan repeated itself with grim predictability. On Tinian, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, their tanks were relegated to being dug in as static, immobile pillboxes, as they knew they stood no chance in a mobile fight. Even then, they were vulnerable to 50-caliber fire, flamethrowers, and bazookas. On Okinawa, the final major battle, the Japanese 27th Tank Regiment, with its 27 remaining tanks, faced an American landing force deploying over 800 tanks. The 30-to-1 numerical disparity, combined with the massive qualitative gap, resulted in the Japanese tanks being systematically annihilated in one last futile counteroffensive. The experience of Japanese tankers in the war's final years was one of a slow, crushing, horrifying realization that their equipment, their tactics, and their core beliefs were fundamentally obsolete. A truth brutally demonstrated not by other, better tanks, but by the simple, terrifying simplicity of machine gun bullets punching through armor that was supposed to keep them safe. After the war, detailed American examinations of captured Ha-Gos at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland confirmed everything that had been learned in combat. The armor was lethally thin, the interior layout dangerously cramped, the commander's workload completely unrealistic, the lack of radios a critical tactical flaw, and the hand-cranked turret painfully slow. The American Sherman, on the contrary, was spacious, well-armored, and technologically superior in every conceivable way, from its efficient three-man turret crew and gyro-stabilized gun to the standard-issue radio in every single tank. But the most telling and decisive difference was not in the vehicles themselves. It was in the industrial systems that produced them. American factories like the massive Detroit tank arsenal, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, produced an astounding 49,234 Shermans during the war. Japan, over the entire course of its war effort, produced only around 2,300 Ha-Gos. This more than 20-to-1 industrial ratio, combined with the vast technological gap, meant the outcome was never, ever in doubt. The Ha-Go, once a proud symbol of Japanese armored might, had become a steel coffin, a tragic representation of the fatal, unbridgeable gap between Japan's imperial ambitions and its limited industrial reality.